Polluted Wastelands 2 was supposed to be the hardest mode in TDS. When it was added, you needed all 4 people to have accelerators, and even with that level of power, you could barely get through the mode. Not too long ago, it was reworked to have much more difficult enemies and less waves for you to prepare. This was intended to be a challenge for an entire team who has access to late game towers. Today, I just beat it solo. I begin the run by placing down a biologist. The game doesn't start until I press ready, and the reason I don't is to let the biologist cooldown go down all the way so that it can spawn lots of flowers when I actually do start the game. This is the only way it's possible to get through the early game, and as an important note, this applies to all spawner towers. In theory, you could do this with Crook Boss, for example. And so just keep in mind that every single attempt requires you to sit here for 2 minutes at the start of the game waiting for the biologist to prepare all of its flowers. And after about that time, I finally click ready, which allows the biologist to start spamming down all of its flowers that it was preparing, which is absolutely necessary for the hundreds of HP worth of enemies that Wave 1 sends out. By killing this wave quickly enough, I'm able to get a second biologist, and with the help of some of the old flowers and the new one from the new biologist, I'm able to get enough money to upgrade it on Wave 2. And from this point on, with just 2 flowers, one of which is upgraded, it turns out that I actually have enough defense to start getting through this mode as intended. I place up to 3 biologists and start working on upgrading them to level 2. As I'm doing this, I encounter hazardous enemies, which have 100 HP with a 50% defense. This is incredibly tough, but thankfully we're playing on the longest map in the game, so this gives us enough time to kill them. They also make us a ton of money, which was going to be absolutely necessary for affording the defense I was going to need. On Wave 4, I afforded my first level 2 biologist, which would spawn out 2 flowers now. On Wave 5, I got another biologist to level 2 just in time for the 800 HP boss that would come out. Let me just remind you, this is Wave 5. As we killed off all the other enemies, I quickly had to set a biologist to weakest in order to gain a bit of extra money so that I could afford a mortar, and that was what's going to help me kill this boss. I managed to shoot it a few times while it was going around the second loop, and after it had went on the third one, it was low enough to just get killed by the biologist there. On Wave 6, I had gotten all of my biologists to level 2 and set one of them to Ivy. This was going to be incredibly useful for slowing down the enemies and clustering them up so that the mortars could do even more damage. On Wave 7, there was some red breakers. You usually never see this on their own, but Polluted Wastelands 2 is just interesting like that. Regardless, I was working on upgrading this mortar to level 3, which would make these absolutely no issue. From then on, I got 4 more mortars, all of them to level 0, which was enough defense to kill 2 of these bosses. With the money I made, I placed down a mercenary base at the very back and upgraded it immediately so that the troops were going to be stacked. As it turns out, 3 biologists is actually a lot of DPS, and it was able to defeat thousands of HP worth of hiddens that came out on Wave 9 here, as well as the boss, but I kinda had help with mortars from that and the mercenary base, so it wasn't all that tough. Wave 10 was a pretty tough wave because it has some aggro bosses, but because one of my mortars is level 3, it's able to get in a ton of damage in that area. And also my mercenary base troops stopped in a pretty good spot, which were going to help me deal with a necromancer. On top of that, I upgraded my mercenary base as soon as I had the money, which would spawn even better troops eventually, as the necromancer was going around towards his third loop. Ultimately, we didn't even need them since the necromancer just died anyways, but Wave 10 would start sending out some of the more annoying enemies, the toxics here. These are now significantly stronger than they used to be, and they leave corpses behind. These were gonna stall quite a bit of time out. Regardless, my mercenary-based troops stopped in a pretty good spot and were able to get out a ton of damage on the hidden enemies that nothing else except for the biologist could see. As it turns out, there was an invisible healing pool right at the intersection of the second and third loop, which healed a lurker all the way back up to 500 HP, and that ended up wiping out all of my mercenary-based troops. This was unfortunate because having them stacked up is really strong, but it's whatever because now my mercenary base could spawn out Riot guards. These were going to be absolutely critical because while the mortars had great splash damage, I really didn't have single target. And it can really be seen here on Wave 12 when one of these Riot guards just annihilates a necromancer. And so that was the plan. I placed down a second mercenary base in the middle this time, which I was going to upgrade to level 4 as well. This was going to give me a damage buff on my mortars, and it was just going to give me more Riot Guards to work with. Wave 13 had some splitters which have a lot of HP, but again, Riot Guards don't care about that. They absolutely shredded them, and these guys made me so much money, I could get all 3 of my mercenary bases to level 4. Wave 14 got a little bit far, but again, as soon as the Riot Guards came out, they just pushed everything back and there was nothing to worry about. Wave 15 is an extremely scary wave. Not if you have 3 level 4 mercenary bases though, and are actively working on level 4 and 5 mortars. The mortar absolutely shreds all of the amalgams, while the Riot Guards do insane damage to the amalgamation. Poor guy couldn't even get to the 3rd loop. From then on, I had to work on my mortars. Polluted Wastelands 2 really likes spamming you with a ton of enemies, so mortar is one of the best things to possibly bring on this map. Wave 17 is a perfect example. There's a ton of breakers here and splitters, which actually push my stuff back pretty far, and the mutagenic blight is actually not all that bad. From then on, I upgrade my biologist to get the nightshade plant. This would be extremely useful for wave 18 here, which would turn around these rushers and allow the mortars to get way more damage in. These guys didn't even make it past the 2nd loop before I killed them, and the amalgamations were no problem either, considering I had 4 max level mortars at this point. I got my last max level mortar on wave 19, and then I started working on swarmers. I don't think I need to explain it, but yeah, swarmers just one of the best towers in the game. So I placed about 8 of them down. You have to set some of them on first, some of them on strongest, and then I'd maxed out my 2nd mercenary base. The first one was already maxed, I just forgot to say. This was going to give me the airdrop ability, which is really good to have for wave 20, because it's the abomination. This thing is incredibly fast, and so I would preemptively drop down some airdrops at the back of the map to get ready to kill this thing off. But as it turns out, it just runs into Riot Guards that were already on the map, so it just dies like instantly after it gets revived. So wave 20 turned out to be no challenge, and I had so much money now that I had maxed out my last mercenary base and had gotten to work on placing down golden minigunners. I'd place down all of my minigunners and upgrade them to level 3 just so I had my placement set out, and then I'd go on to max my biologists. Having 2 nightshade flowers and 1 ivy, I'm not sure if it's the best, but it gets pretty much the most damage dealt, and it also turns around the enemies, so that's what I chose to do. And also, not to mention, I was working on getting a stack of grenadiers with a field medic at the back. This was just to get more damage dealt than the Riot Guards would have. Wave 22 was pretty tough, but because the swarmers had so much time to get up their B stacks, and I had a relatively strong stack of grenadiers at the back, this guy didn't even make it past the 2nd loop. Wave 23 was also tough with a necromancer king, but after dropping down even more grenadiers, this guy would get absolutely shredded by all the DPS. Now at this point, I had maxed all of my minis, gotten down all of my swarmers. Now it was just time to wait for wave 25. Wave 24 is a pretty tough round with a nuclear guardian that has 250,000 HP. By the way, just for reference, we're already in territory that's harder than Fallen mode, but what's super crucial to beating Polluted Wastelands 2 solo is getting up a strong stack of grenadiers. This was looking pretty good. Wave 25 would come out, and I would start microing the mercenary base. I had to get as much DPS as physically possible, so having a giant stack of grenadiers, all protected by the field medics, was the only thing I could hope could get me through this. After getting a big enough stack, I started dropping Riot Guards and field medics to try and keep as many of these alive as possible, as the nuclear monster would stun and kill them, and there would be a bunch of little enemies running through, mowing down my grenadiers. The nuclear monster ended up getting stuck, which is actually really useful to helping me beat this, and so to the best of my abilities, I was selling and rebuying the mercenary base just to use the Riot Guard ability to get as many of these down as possible to help me do as much damage as I could to the enemies. Things were looking great. The horde was starting to thin out, and I was just down to the nuclear guardians, which seemed so close, but they had over 100,000 HP. This is the grim reality of any challenge in TDS. Sometimes you could do things so perfectly, or at least it seems that way, and be so far. This is unseen. I would come back to try again. One of these attempts I died way earlier on, and this is soul-crushing. You have to sit here through over 20 minutes of doing the same stuff over and over, just to get back to this last wave, and then for seemingly no reason, play it the same way as all the other times, but this time it's just worse? There's almost no pattern to this. This reality is why I almost never do any hard challenges in TDS. You need so much willpower to just sit there and redo the same thing over and over, hoping that one little change in your strategy is gonna make all the difference, and it just doesn't. But this video is titled How I Beat Polluted Wastelands 2 Solo, with just one small change: replacing Golden Minigunner with bottom path pursuits, which I'd set to random targeting, with an exceptional stack of grenadiers that I built up, and the fastest spamming of Riot Guards that I could. I present to you this run. The nuclear monster never gets stuck. Nuclear guardians make it all the way to the very end, but through all this, I persist. I spam down Riot guards like no tomorrow. Which by the way, it's harder for me to do this than literally anybody else because I have a giant monitor and my buttons are so small, so I have to be very accurate. But as the nuclear monster rounds his last bend, all the stacks of swarmers and all of the Riot guards running in are too much for it to handle. This is the culmination of over 6 hours of work. So if you enjoyed, like, subscribe, use StarCode, and I'll see ya next time.